Christmas night, 5501. I remember it just like any other day. Icy cold with wind that could cut a fella in half. I had made my way to a local haberdashery where I would end up renting a room for the night. Probably some of the best sleep that I had ever had, quite frankly. Comfortable beds with real feathered pillows. I woke up the next morning and had a very nice warm cup of tea. I needed all the energy I could get, for I was on a hunt, friends, a mission, you could even say. I am a bounty hunter, and you best believe that I plan on making my fortune and my reputation in these parts. Well, not exactly in these parts per se. I wouldn't want to litter the fine grounds of this haberdashery with corpses of bounties. Indeed, I'll be traveling a few miles down the trail into some nearby mountains. Incredibly difficult to traverse, especially during the snowy months, unless you know your way around, which I just so happen to. Perfect for defensive purposes. As you can imagine, a life like mine with my occupation tends to be quite dangerous. After traveling for some time, I was becoming quite cold, so I decided to hack down a few trees and go about setting up camp for the night. Wearing my greatcoat was quite warm, but building myself an even warmer fire to snuggle up to under the stars tonight would be much better, of course. As dawn broke, I began to realize that the place I was searching for all this time, I had finally arrived. This was the perfect place to set up shop. Contrary to popular belief, every bounty hunter needs a home, even if it is temporary. Given these basic human requirements for shelter, I decided to begin lobbing down many a tree here in this forest to go about building my little home. Given that wood is the primary resource in these parts, I thought a nice large log cabin would be quite fitting. I was quick to throw up the walls, stuffing dirt in between the logs to insulate the place nicely. And then we began on the heart and soul of any log cabin, a nice warm fireplace, a comfy little bedroom, as well as a nice place to sit and eat some meals and maybe even have some coffee or tea. Home sweet home, at least for the time being, that is. Who knows, if things go quite well, we might even set up a bounty hunting agency here. To celebrate the occasion, I decided to smoke a cigar just off the steps of my porch. After that, it was time to come back inside and warm up by the fireplace. But more importantly, it was also time for us to begin our work, one of which was worth 631 silver alive and just so happened to be an impid revolutionary that was wanted by the British troops. Don't mind if I do. Luckily, it seems to only be a few miles south from where I've set up shop, just a little bit down the river. But given the fact that they require the impid revolutionary alive, I'm gonna have to stop in at my new client's nearby settlement and purchase some items. Once I spent what little silver I had on this new item, I began making my way further south along the river to the camp. Upon my arrival, I was quite surprised to see that their little abode was actually some type of makeshift base on stilts in the middle of a pond. This would make infiltrating the base to get our prize a little bit harder. Luckily for me, I have no plans of doing so. I plan on luring them out with my newly purchased rifle. This bad boy should cut quite a shine. Slowly and cautiously, I began to approach some of these small hills behind their little shack to hide and sneak up on them. Eventually, I made my way around and began firing at the comrade of our suspect, shooting him in the chest and killing him damn near instantly. One down, one to go. When our target finally showed their ugly head, I whipped out my old pistol here, as the caliber is much lower, and thus after shooting them a few times, they were still alive, thankfully. Now all we had to do was stuff their wounds with a little bit of grass and dirt, just enough to keep them alive long enough until we took them back to the British to get our money. Now, if they end up dying while they're in custody before they can be executed, that's none of my business. I'm King the Bounty Hunter after all, not King the Hangman. We eventually would return home with all of our riches, about 631 silver, as promised by the soldiers, of course. After returning home, we had a loner by the name of Nestor who was actually wanting to join us here and join the bounty hunting lifestyle. Normally, we would just turn random people away, but he was an old-timer such as myself, and thus I felt quite pitiful for him. We old dogs have to stick together after all. Let's hope this lifestyle suits him. After all, it's not for the weak of heart. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, we weren't exactly expecting any company, so we would have to fasten him a sleeping bag out of the leathers of some wild game we've been hunting in the mountains. Not exactly living high on the hog, as they say, but it sure beats sleeping outside in the cold. Of course, though, if he's going to be our bounty hunting partner, we want him to have some proper accommodations and a home of his own so that our little cabin doesn't get too crowded, of course. And that's exactly why we decided to go about building him his very own cabin, which is quite a bit smaller than ours, I'll admit, but we are the main bounty hunter here and the leader of what may end up becoming something of a company. But again, I reiterate, it sure beats sleeping outside. To celebrate the occasion, we cracked open a few brewskis, and we also began taking a look at some more active warrants. One of which being for a French deserter. I think this is something that we might be interested in. It appears that he's hiding out deep in French territory, not too far from one of their towns. Without a second thought, we began making our way there. Luckily for us, it was just off the main road and didn't take us very long to arrive at all. To our surprise, it appeared to be a similar structure to what we had recently seen with our impid target, meaning that this is some impid architecture for sure. Ah yes, I see now, hiding out in the forest with your impid lover, eh? Ah yes, how typical of a man to ignore the service to his country for a lady. I'm afraid that you've acquired quite the bounty though, friend, and you're going to have to come with us. Initially, we attempted to approach the site quite cautiously, but they saw us coming up due to the lack of vegetation in the area, and thus we would have to begin engaging with his beloved impid. Though this was a foolish move on her part, because all she had to defend herself were some sharp rocks, she still ended up doing it. Leaving her dead, as you can see. Quite enraged by the death of his beloved, the deserter began firing at us from afar. Managing to get a lucky shot on Nestor, he was downed, and we had to run in, rescue him, and run off to the hills to hide. At which point, I began tending to his wounds to ensure that our elderly friend didn't bleed out, but the deserter was hot on our trail. As Nestor was wailing in pain, another shootout with the deserter would commence. But I quickly grew tired of these games, and I decided to rush him with Nestor's knife, stabbing him in the abdomen quite a few times, I might add, taking him to the ground shortly thereafter. I'm no spry chicken, but I wouldn't be outdone by this coward. I started tending to his wounds quite reluctantly given what he had just done to us, but I had to if I wanted any money out of this. Thankfully, Nestor and the prisoner both would survive, and we would end up making a pretty penny off of him at a nearby French town. And as you can see, we really earned our money on this one, as it took quite a toll on us. No rest for the wicked, as they say, or those who end up catching the wicked. Luckily, bounty targets also don't get to keep their weapons, so we also got paid with this very nice French army sword. Now that we're back home though, this entire time we've been living off the land, doing a good bit of hunting as well as picking some berries and other wild vegetation, but now that spring has truly sprung and the ground is thawed out, I thought we should probably go about planting some corn and potatoes. I would also end up building a little campfire with a steel cauldron over top of it. That way we could cook some proper meals like a nice hearty potato and corn stew once the crops are ready. During this time, I also noticed a couple of vagabonds who were actually skulking around our cabins. It turns out this lady and her child were attempting to buy back one of their friends who were recently kidnapped. All they needed was 35 silver. Now, of course, there's always the possibility that they're lying just to try to get some money from us, and 35 silver is nothing to turn your nose at, but I have what you might call a bleeding heart, and thus I decided to make a donation to them. I can only hope that they are able to truly get their friend back. We were also beginning to get a little bit tired of storing all of our items right in our living room where we're eating our meals and also warming up by the fire in the cabin, so we decided to also begin working on something of a storage warehouse. Just a small wooden shack with plenty of shelves for all of our items as well as building materials. Interestingly, or unfortunately I should say, we ended up having a tribal caravan arriving, but this just so happened to be a slaver. How I wish I could have bought the freedom of all of these poor souls, but I only had enough money to purchase one of them. A gentleman by the name of Cheddar. After purchasing his freedom for him, we did offer to let him go, but he stated he had no tribe to go home to anymore, and so we offered him a position in our bounty hunting company, to which, of course, he accepted. But there was just one little problem. Cheddar was sleeping on the floor and or dining room chair, I guess? And you can't just buy a man his freedom and expect him to lay out in the dirt in the dining room. No, we needed to build him a proper home. So after spending many a day felling many a tree and collecting their precious wooden resource, we decided to go about doing so. We would actually begin with 2 structures this time around. Of course, as mentioned, one of them was going to be a nice narrow little cabin for Cheetah. Nothing too special to mention there. He had everything that the rest of us had: a dresser, some end tables, a table to eat meals at, a fireplace, all with the exception of a rug, which we actually added to all of our cabins to beautify them and make their quality better. But the second structure is quite interesting, as this is going to be our makeshift jailhouse for the time being, as you can see by the sail doors. It came to me in an idea when I began thinking, what if we have a bounty target who we can't get to their destination due to a certain distance, something like that, and perhaps we get a great big snow making travel very difficult. We need somewhere to keep them, essentially. And as you can see, what was previously a lush forest that was devoid of any civilization has quickly become our bounty hunting town. Speaking of which, it's been far too long since we've went on any type of mission to hunt down any bounties, and it's about time that Cheetah got a feel for what this is really like. Ah yes, Toyo Stork wanted for 1,200 silver for kidnapping. I wonder if she has anything to do with those vagabonds we donated money to. Nevertheless, Toyo was a wanted woman and we were hot on her heels. She, just as many of these outlaws with a bounty on their back, were hiding out in a shabby shack in the forest. Based on our view in the dark of the glowing of their torches and their lanterns, it appears that she's not alone either. She could be seen near the pond wielding a large round object, which I take is some type of makeshift explosive like dynamite. Her counterpart was a large Neanderthal man wielding a beautiful pistol with a beautiful half coat on. Unfortunately though, his beautiful half coat was bright red, making it quite easy to track him around. We began firing at them. Toyo ended up taking cover inside while her security would try to join her. Of course, we attempted to cut him off though. We couldn't allow these bastards to go inside where it's close quarters and they might have the upper hand on us, so we would end up taking them down right at the door. Toyo had managed to begin crawling away in a puddle of her own blood inside, and as we were tracking the puddle of blood, we would come upon her, and we would also come upon our worst fears. On the ground lie 35 pieces of our own silver, as well as both of the vagabonds that we had given it to. Outside, near some dried pools of blood, was a gentleman in a nice coat. My guess is that this was the friend that they were hoping to buy back. Such a cruel world we live in. Given their cruelty towards these innocent people, let alone one of these people being a child, we saw no issue with stripping them of their clothing down to their birthday suits before we finally took them into justice. Not only to humiliate them a bit, but Cheetah also could use some proper clothing, and this was much cheaper than going out and buying any. And with that, we were off to the nearest French town to speak with the constable about our reward. Needless to say, he was quite tickled to see that we had brought in 2 ne'er-do-wells for the price of 1, and thus he threw in a little extra silver for the trouble. Ah, the Lord's work is never done, but it does sure feel good to do it. We would return home shortly thereafter and begin taking all of our newfound riches to our storage building. Now that we're finally back home, it's time for us to focus on our community once more, if only briefly, and by doing so, what we're actually doing is planting a small field of hay grass. That way, in the future, hopefully we can attract some wild horses and maybe even possibly break them to make a horse-drawn wagon. But as mentioned, our return would only be brief as we had gotten information about a nearby item stash. So after a few days, we decided to head back out and to check it out. Now this isn't a bounty per se, but there is a good possibility of riches. And depending on what's there, it could be some type of useful weapon, somebody's stash that we could use to help us out with our bounty hunting duties, or possibly some items that we could sell and then use that money to purchase items to help us out further. After our arrival at this item stash, there were no bandits or anyone to be seen, but there were 2 very large grizzly bears with an even larger pile of dried blood, bones, and corpse bile, which was none too settling, I'll say. With it being dark and all, we had hoped to try to sneak past these wild animals, but that was not the case. They began chasing us and attempting to maul us, to to which we have of course had to defend ourselves, and we had to kill them both. Ah yes, sorry about that, old girl, but I'm afraid you forced our hands. On the bright side, however, these two large grizzly bears will make for plenty of delicious stew on the road back home, and possibly here in just a moment. But first, we have bigger bears to fry with the item stash itself. After opening up the doors, we found 2 books inside. Nothing too exciting, of course, but we also found a handheld mortar. Almost an identical design to a blunderbuss, except instead of shooting out rocks, nails, and anything else you can shove down the barrel, it has its own explosive shells. After gathering up our new items, I thought it would be a good idea while we're out on the road to go ahead and begin looking for our next target. I was a little bit confused as this person had a bounty on their back for arson, which is kinda common, but not all that common unless you happen to be an impid, and in that case you just about can't help it, of course. And then after I arrived, I realized that this person seems to be attempting to join the impid tribe, and thus why they're probably setting everything on fire, but nonetheless we plan on bringing them to justice. This would also be the perfect opportunity for us to test out our newly acquired weapon, and I must say that it was incredibly effective. Utilizing our new weapon as well as the muskets we already had in our possession, a shootout would begin between us and the tribespeople. This was a little bit more difficult than we had expected, as we had no idea there would be this many enemies here. And given their preference of flaming weaponry, things were really beginning to heat up, as you could see. Based on our experience, really the only way that we could go about taking them down was with some close quarters hand-to-hand combat. After killing many of her associates though, we would be able to focus on our target as she began attempting to flee the area. She was wading through the swampy water and she came this close to getting away, but that's when I fired. Bit of a close call there in more ways than one. Not only did she almost get away, but we almost completely killed her by shattering her spine with a musket ball, and on closer inspection, she appeared to be a he and was attempting to conceal his identity. Either way though, we would bring him to justice and return home shortly thereafter. Upon our return home, we just went about some basic spring cleaning, even though it was actually almost winter time, and we were also finally beginning to harvest all of our crops that we've been growing for quite some time, one of which of course being our recent field of hay grass. After using the hay to attract some wild horses, we had finally got them broken and we would actually hook them up to a stagecoach wagon that we built. Given our occupation, I thought it would probably be pretty fitting for us to go ahead and paint the old wagon black instead of the standard wooden brown. Perhaps it'll intimidate some of the bounties that we're chasing. Oh, we are truly living high on the hog now, friends. We loaded up our brand new wagon with plenty of silver and headed down the river to the nearby British town to do a little bit of trading with him. At which point we had purchased 4 dogs, specifically beagles. Not only man's best friend, but the beagle is bounty hunter's best friend, as they'll be able to track a scent of one of our bounties for miles on end. Now, if we want these dogs to take care of us and to do their jobs properly, though, we are going to have to take care of them, and I really mean take care of them. And that's why we're actually going to be building them their own little houses. Now, of course, these are just some kennels, but they will be keeping them nice and warm and out of the elements. With that, it was finally time for us to start on their training. We're going to be training them to guard and to attack on command. And to make sure that they're properly incentivized, we're going to be filling up their little bellies. All we really had was some corn and potatoes though, so if we want this to go smoothly, I think we're going to need to find some venison for them. Given how crucial these animals are to us and to our little growing bounty hunter business, we would actually begin focusing primarily on their training. A big thing that we've struggled with so far, but also have been very lucky with so far, is not killing any of our bounty targets that don't need to be killed, because if we have to bring them in alive and we shoot them in the back of the head, they very well could easily die, of course, and our dogs attacking them is going to keep them them incapacitated, but also not dead. After many a day of feeding and training, they were well fed and becoming well trained, though the path to doing so would take a little while, of course. Then I began to think, with our new horse wagon, we needed a proper place to keep it, as well as any more mounts that we end up taming and or buying. You never know when one of these bounty targets might have a fine steed that needs a new home after their owner has been hung in a nearby town, and thus of course we ended up building ourselves a new barn. Again, simply a place to keep our critters out of the elements, but of course also a great place to store all of our hay that we're growing. Just the same, I thought it would be a good idea for us to build a proper food storage building that's not too far from our campfire and cauldron where we're cooking all of our meals. This helps free up a lot of room in the main cabin, and we also have an embrasure as part of the structure. That way we can let all the freezing cold winter air in to go about freezing the food, thus keeping it fresh. Speaking of which, it was during this time that we actually ended up getting our very first snow of the season. My friends, winter is just around the corner. And with it comes a lot of trouble with traveling the roads as well as the forests. So it may be best for us to go about settling down throughout the winter and just focusing on ourselves instead of hunting bounties. However, that does also mean that we need one last big score before winter comes and keeps us stuck in our cabins. A target worth just under 2,500 silver should do the trick. Even with the light snow that we're currently getting, we would actually be able to traverse quite easily thanks to our horse-drawn carriage. Upon our arrival, the snow had finally stopped, just barely coating the ground, making it quite easy to see an impet with red skin wearing a bright red soldier coat, dual-wielding flintlock pistols. We also spotted our target wielding a gigantic wall rifle that really packs a punch, wearing a light blue soldier coat. Not really the best attire given the circumstances for them. We stood by our wagon for a bit, prepping our dogs and also gathering up gear like our bombs and those pistols that we've gotten from previous bounty hunts, though I'm hoping we won't even need them. For you see, my friends, even though we do truly love our new furry companions, when it comes to a hunt for some bounty targets in the heat of battle like this, they are expendable, and that's why we are sending them in to take out our targets. And as you can see after their extensive training sessions, not only are they the best damn sniffers in the whole world, they're also quite aggressive, taking down targets with relative ease. First went our actual target, and then his bride-to-be, or lover, or whatever she was. After our beagles finally took her to the ground, we would begin tending to her wounds as well as the targets, because of course we want to fetch a fair penny for them and not actually have them die, though I was quite interested in her pistols either way. Ah yes, our furry little friend's truly done one hell of a job today, and I look forward to many hunts with him in the very near future, or after winter ends I suppose, as the snow is getting quite heavy now, and so is the cold. After approaching the little cabin that they've been staying in, we found a little bit of jade, some tobacco leaves, and some bioferrite. I plan on selling 2 of those 3 items. Funny enough, at the exact same French town that we're going to be taking our target to have his head cut off or possibly be hanged or whatever they deem fit for his crimes. Eventually, we had finally returned home with our wagon and with all the things that we had collected, especially our prize money. We've made ourselves a very, very pretty penny this hunting season. Here's hoping for many more. Now, you may have noticed that we actually brought back the imped woman to our little town here, and we're going to be putting her in one of our cells. The reason being is because our beagle's done quite a number on her, and she wasn't really worth much if we were to turn her in. As of right now, you can barely recognize her, so we're going to need to give her some time to heal up before we make any money off of her. After returning home from a successful hunt, it was time to start rolling up some of that tobacco we decided to keep into some fine cigarettes as a celebration. But we're not going to be celebrating only because of a successful hunt and all of the moolah that we've made this hunting season. No, my friends, it is also Christmas Day, meaning that it's also been almost an entire year since we set up shop here in these mountains for our business, and we have achieved so much during that time. Time to smoke some of that fine red apple tobacco and maybe even crack open a brew broski or two. A couple of old fellers like ourselves here, we don't really have any friends or family, well, other than each other, and our beagles, of course. But you know what? That's enough. After a night filled with drinking and smoking, we decided to have ourselves a little shooting competition. Probably not the best idea given the circumstances, but it was sure a hell of a lot of fun. And then, given the holiday, we decided to offer some kindness to our prisoner, an olive branch, if you will, in the form of a singular alcoholic beverage. Now, I don't think she was too excited about this, seeing how her lover just met his end at the long arm of the law's hands, at our hands as well, but it's the thought that counts, right? We would spend the rest of the night standing around the fireplace telling some old war stories and stories of our lives growing up, Christmases past, and just enjoying each other's company, petting on our dogs, all that great stuff, you know. A Merry Christmas to one, a Merry Christmas to all. For all we shall protect, as is our duty, or we shall catch, as is our duty also. I'm not very good at rhymes. Merry Christmas.